Is it wrong for having Christmas at my grandparents' house and accepting gifts from them when they won't include my step-and-half siblings? I'm a 16-year-old guy, and I've been struggling with a situation that's been eating at me for weeks. I want to share my story, but I also need your honest opinion. Am I wrong for the choices I made, or are the circumstances just too complicated? Let me explain. When I was 5 years old, my dad passed away. My sister, who's now 19, was only 8 at the time. Losing him was devastating, but we had our grandparents, my dad's parents, to lean on. They were a big part of our lives until something happened that changed everything. A few months after Dad's death, my mom and his family had a major falling out. I was too young to understand what caused it, but the result was clear. My grandparents were cut off from us. No more visits, no more calls, no connection at all. That was how it stayed until my grandparents took my mom to court. They fought for and won grandparents' visitation rights. From then on, they were legally entitled to see us for 10 daylight hours a month, 1 overnight visit per month, and the weekend before or after Christmas. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them in our lives. Still, the arrangement wasn't smooth. My mum hated it and never let us forget it. She remarried a few years later, and when she and my stepdad tried to get him to adopt us, I think part of her hope was to cut my dad's family out for good. That didn't happen. My sister and I refused to be adopted, and her lawyers told her that even if we had been, it wouldn't have stopped the court-ordered visits. This is where things get complicated. My stepdad came into the picture with 2 kids of his own, and later he and my mom had 2 more together. My step-sibling's mother had passed away, and they didn't have much extended family. That meant me and my sister were the only ones with additional grandparents, and my mom and stepdad didn't like it. So, here's the question. Am I wrong for sticking with the family that's always been there for me, even when it creates tension at home? When I think back to my early childhood, it's my dad's laugh and the way he'd carry me on his shoulders that stand out the most. He was the kind of dad who made you feel like the center of the universe, even when life was messy. My sister and I were his everything. I still remember how he'd call her his little helper and me his big guy, even though I was tiny. Our world felt complete with him in it. After he passed away, things changed so fast. I didn't fully understand what death meant at the time. I just knew that he wasn't coming home anymore. Suddenly it was just the 3 of us, me, my sister, and my mom, trying to figure out how to move forward. In those early months, my dad's family, especially my grandparents, were our rock. They'd come over often, bringing meals, helping with school pickups, and just being there when we needed them most. But as the weeks turned into months, I could sense that something was wrong. The visits became less frequent, and my mom would argue with them whenever they came by. I didn't understand what they were fighting about, but I could tell it wasn't good. Then one day they just stopped coming. I asked my mom why, and she said it was for the best. For the best? It didn't feel that way to me. Those early years were a blur of loss and confusion. My sister tried to be strong for me, but I knew she was hurting too. We both missed Dad terribly, and losing our connection to his family felt like losing him all over again. Looking back, I think that's when I first started feeling torn between 2 worlds. The breaking point between my mom and my dad's family wasn't something I fully grasped at the time, but its impact was impossible to miss. I remember the tension building like a storm. There were hushed arguments behind closed doors and moments when my mom would come out visibly upset. My grandparents stopped visiting as often, and when they did, the mood was heavy, awkward silence or curt conversations that didn't feel like the warm family gatherings I'd been used to. Then, one day, they were just gone. My mum told us there had been a fight, something about boundaries and decisions about how we were being raised. She never went into detail, but it was clear she was angry. She framed it like they were overstepping, like they thought they could parent us better than she could. My sister and I were caught in the middle, too young to understand the specifics but old enough to feel the loss. For months we didn't see or hear from them. My mom tried to fill the void, insisting we didn't need anyone but her. Still, there was no replacing the connection we'd had with them. I missed their hugs, their stories about my dad, and the way they made him feel alive in a way photos and old clothes never could. Eventually, my grandparents took my mom to court. They fought for the right to see us, and after what felt like an eternity, The judge ruled in their favor. The court ordered specific visitation rights, 10 daylight hours a month, 1 overnight stay per month, and time with them the weekend before or after Christmas. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. Mom wasn't happy about it. She made her feelings clear every time we packed our bags for a visit. The tension at home only grew, but for me and my sister, those hours with our grandparents were a lifeline. They gave us a chance to hold on to a part of Dad, even if it meant walking on eggshells when we got back home. At first, the court-ordered visits felt strange, like we were sneaking away to a secret world where things were warmer, more familiar. Every month, my sister and I would pack our things and head to our grandparents' house. Those visits were structured and limited, but they became a sanctuary, a place where we could breathe and feel connected to our dad again. Our grandparents did everything they could to make those hours count. They'd tell us stories about Dad, showing us old photo albums and sharing little pieces of him that we never got to experience ourselves. We'd bake cookies, play games, and just exist in a way that felt effortless. For those few hours, it was like the weight of everything at home disappeared. But when the visits were over, reality hit hard. We'd come back to a house where our mom's mood had turned icy. She wouldn't say much, but her silence spoke volumes. Sometimes she'd make little comments. "I hope they didn't spoil you too much," or "must be nice to have time to waste." It was clear she saw those visits as a betrayal, even if we didn't. As time went on, my sister and I learned to navigate the balance. We didn't talk much about what happened during our visits, and we kept any gifts or mementos at our grandparents' house to avoid arguments. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way to keep the peace. Even with the limitations, those visits were a lifeline. They reminded us that we had a history and a family beyond the walls of our house. And for me, they became a chance to hold onto my dad's memory in a way that felt tangible and real, even if it came with a cost. When my mum remarried, things shifted again. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about my stepdad. I was only 9, and suddenly there was this new guy in our house trying to play the role of a father figure. He had 2 kids of his own from a previous marriage, and while I didn't know them very well at first, it was clear that they were part of the package deal now. It didn't take long for me to realize that the family dynamic was changing. My mom was happy with him, and I could see that he was trying to fit into our lives. But it wasn't the same as before. There was no father around to make us feel safe and special. My stepdad was decent, but I still longed for the kind of warmth I had known with my dad. As for my step-siblings, things were complicated. They were older than me, and we never really clicked. I understood that they had their own struggles, especially with their mom passing away when they were younger. It wasn't their fault that I couldn't just jump into this new family structure. Still, it made me feel out of place. Their lives were so different from mine, and their family, with its own unique set of challenges, didn't feel like a fit for me. Soon after, my mom and stepdad had 2 more kids together, adding to the mix. With each new addition, I felt like more of an outsider. The family was growing, but I was still clinging to my past, especially to the bond I had with my dad's side of the family. While everyone around me was building new connections, I felt myself retreating further into the old ones. And yet, no matter how disconnected I felt at home, my dad's family always made sure I knew I was still part of theirs. The challenge, though, was that not everyone appreciated this connection. Not long after the wedding, my mom and stepdad brought up the idea of him adopting me and my sister. On the surface, it seemed like a way to make our new family feel more unified. But for my sister and me, it didn't feel right. We still had a strong connection to our dad, and the idea of being adopted felt like erasing that part of ourselves. When my mom first mentioned it, I could tell she was excited. She framed it as something positive, like it would make things simpler for us at school or give us a sense of belonging in our new family. But my sister and I didn't see it that way. She was more vocal about it than I was, pointing out that we already had a dad, even if he wasn't here anymore. I felt the same way but wasn't as good at saying it out loud. Our refusal didn't go over well. My mom was hurt, and my stepdad seemed uncomfortable. I think they both took it personally, as if we were rejecting them instead of protecting our bond with our dad. Things got even more complicated when my grandparents found out. They were furious at the thought of us being adopted by someone outside of the family. They saw it as a betrayal of my dad's memory, and their anger only made the situation worse. Even after my mum's lawyers confirmed that the court-mandated visitation rights wouldn't be affected by an adoption, my sister and I stood our ground. We didn't want to be adopted, and that was final. The fallout from that decision lingered in our house for a long time. My mum tried to move past it, but the unspoken tension never really went away. It was yet another wedge driven between us and the rest of the family. The tension over the adoption wasn't the only thing making life at home difficult. Living in a blended family brought its own challenges, especially when it came to relationships with my step and half-siblings. My sister and I never fully clicked with my stepdad's kids, and as time went on, the gap between us only seemed to grow. Part of the issue was jealousy, though none of us would have admitted it outright. My step-siblings didn't have much extended family of their own, and my mom and stepdad weren't close to anyone in their families either. Meanwhile, my sister and I still had our dad's family, grandparents who showed up for us in ways our step and half siblings didn't experience. It created an unspoken divide that made things uncomfortable. My step-siblings used to ask why they weren't included in our visits with our dad's family. At first it seemed innocent enough, but over time the questions turned into complaints. They'd make comments like, "It's not fair," or "Why don't they think of us as family too?" My sister was always blunt in her responses, reminding them that our dad's family wasn't obligated to include them because they weren't related. I think she saw it as a matter of boundaries, but to them, it probably came off as dismissive or cold. The tension escalated when my grandparents started doing more for us, paying for school trips, buying us laptops, and eventually helping my sister with college. My step-siblings couldn't hide their resentment, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. It wasn't their fault that they didn't have the same support system we did, but at the same time it wasn't our fault either. Living in that environment felt like walking a tightrope. No matter what I did, someone was upset. My sister and I held on to our bond with our dad's family, even if it meant constant friction at home. But deep down, I wondered if things could ever truly feel fair or equal in a family that was so fundamentally divided. My grandparents were always there for my sister and me in ways that went beyond the court-mandated visits. They didn't just show up. They showed up with purpose. Over the years, they became more than just a connection to our dad. They were a source of stability and support that we couldn't find anywhere else. One of the earliest examples I can remember is when they bought us laptops during the pandemic. School had shifted online, and we didn't have the technology to keep up. My mom and stepdad were already struggling with money, so asking them for laptops felt impossible. My grandparents stepped in without hesitation. They made sure my sister and I had what we needed to succeed, even when it meant we stood out from the rest of the kids in the house. There were other moments like that too. Field trips that couldn't be paid for, extracurricular activities that required fees. My grandparents always found a way to help us participate. For my sister, their support extended even further when she graduated high school. They helped her move out and covered much of her college tuition. My mom was livid when she found out. She felt it was unfair that they didn't offer the same help to my step and half siblings. I can see why my mum felt that way. From her perspective, it must have looked like my sister and I were being treated as more important than the other kids. But from my grandparents' point of view, we were their only connection to their son. Helping us wasn't about playing favorites, it was about honoring his memory. Still, their generosity created a lot of resentment at home. No matter how much they gave, it felt like it always came at a cost. My mom's resentment toward my grandparents only seemed to grow with time. At first it was subtle, little comments here and there about how they were spoiling us or how it wasn't fair to the rest of the family. But as my sister and I got older, the bitterness became harder for her to hide. I think a lot of it came down to control. My mom didn't like that my grandparents could make such a big impact on our lives without her input. She'd say things like, "It's not their place," or "They're just trying to make me look bad." For her, every gift or act of generosity from them seemed like a personal attack. When my sister moved out and started college, things hit a new low. My grandparents paid for almost everything: tuition, books, even part of her rent. My mum tried to argue that if they could afford to do that, they should help out with the other kids too. But my grandparents were firm. They weren't responsible for my step and half siblings. They'd say, We're doing this for our grandkids, for our sons' children. That's where our obligation lies." Hearing that only made my mom angrier. She felt like they were drawing a line in the sand, and we were on one side while the rest of the family was left out. She'd vent about it at home, saying things like, "You'd think they'd care about all the kids, not just their own," or "How can they be so heartless?" Her frustration created a ripple effect. My stepdad tried to stay neutral, but it was clear he wasn't happy with the situation either, and my step-siblings, they started looking at me and my sister differently, like we were somehow to blame for the divide. It was exhausting. No matter how much we tried to explain that we didn't control our grandparents' choices, it didn't seem to matter. The resentment was there, and it wasn't going away. For my mom, it felt like a battle she was losing, and for me, it was just another reason to feel stuck in the middle. Christmas that year was a turning point. With my mom and stepdad's financial struggles, the holiday season was already shaping up to be stressful. Gifts were going to be minimal, and my mum made it clear that she expected us to pitch in by being considerate. For her, that meant one thing, asking my grandparents to include everyone in their Christmas plans. She framed it as a matter of fairness. "It's not right for you and your sister to come back with piles of gifts when the others get so little," she said. "If your grandparents care about you, they'll make an effort for your siblings too." I knew where she was coming from, but I also knew my grandparents wouldn't budge. They'd made it clear over the years, they didn't see my step and half-siblings as family, and they weren't going to treat them like they were. My mom didn't see it that way. To her, it was about standing together as a family. "If they can't include everyone, maybe you shouldn't go," she said. "Show them that it's not okay to leave people out." The idea of skipping Christmas with my grandparents felt impossible. That time with them wasn't just about gifts. It was about feeling connected to my dad and holding on to a part of him that we'd already lost so much of. When I told her I wasn't going to stay home, the disappointment in her eyes hit hard. "I'm not asking you to give up your family," she said. "I'm asking you to think about everyone else too." But no matter how much she tried to guilt me into it, I couldn't bring myself to miss Christmas with the people who made me feel whole. It felt like I was being asked to choose sides, and I knew that no matter what I chose, someone would end up hurt. When my mum reached out to my grandparents about including my step and half-siblings in Christmas, I knew it wouldn't go well. She tried to approach it diplomatically, framing it as an opportunity to bring the whole family together and make things less uncomfortable at home. But my grandparents didn't see it that way. To them, it wasn't about being fair. It was about honoring their relationship with me and my sister, their only biological grandchildren. Their response was firm. They told her they had no intention of buying gifts for kids who weren't related to them. "We're not trying to be cruel," they said, "but those children aren't part of our family. We love my sister and me because they're our son's kids. That's where our focus is." When my mom relayed their answer to me, she was livid. She said it was selfish of them to draw such a hard line and accused them of purposely driving a wedge between us and the rest of the family. "How do you think your siblings feel, knowing they'll never be good enough for your grandparents?" she asked. I didn't know how to respond. I understood why she was upset, but I also understood my grandparents' perspective. This wasn't new behavior for them, and I couldn't blame them for wanting to prioritize their connection to my sister and me. Still, hearing their refusal made things at home even more tense. My step and half-siblings started making comments again, asking why my grandparents hated them or couldn't even try to be nice. My sister, as usual, didn't sugarcoat anything. "They're not our dad's family," she told them. "Why would you expect anything different?" As Christmas approached, the situation became impossible to ignore. My mom insisted I take a stand and skip the celebration at my grandparents' house. But I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on the people who had been there for me my whole life, even if it meant dealing with the fallout at home. As Christmas drew closer, the pressure from my mom ramped up. She wasn't just asking me to skip the celebration at my grandparents' house, she was demanding it. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same point. I should stand with my siblings, not accept gifts from people who refuse to include them. "You're old enough to understand how unfair this is," she said one evening. "Imagine how it feels for your siblings to know they'll never be treated like you and your sister." Her words stung, and I could see how much this situation was weighing on her. But it wasn't as simple as she was making it out to be. My sister had already made her decision. She told my mum in no uncertain terms that she wasn't going to miss Christmas with our grandparents. "This is about our family, not theirs," she said, and while I agreed with her, I wasn't as confident about saying it out loud. My mum turned her focus to me, hoping I'd change my mind and tip the scales in her favor. At school, I tried to block out the tension, but at home it was impossible to escape. My step-siblings kept dropping comments about how lucky we were, and my half-siblings, too young to fully understand, asked why Santa only visited our other family. The guilt was relentless, and no matter what I decided, I knew someone would feel hurt or betrayed. Still, deep down, I couldn't bring myself to skip Christmas with my grandparents. I'd already lost so much of my dad, and those moments with his family were some of the only pieces of him I had left. No matter how much I wanted to make things easier for my mom, I couldn't let go of that connection. When Christmas morning came, my sister and I packed our bags and headed to our grandparents' house. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I knew how upset my mom was, and I could feel the weight of her disappointment as I walked out the door. But I also knew this was something I couldn't give up. My dad's family was a part of me, and being with them during the holidays felt like the only way to keep that part alive. The celebration at my grandparents' house was everything I'd hoped it would be. Their home was warm and inviting, with the scent of fresh pine and baked cookies filling the air. They had gone all out, like they always did, decorating the house and putting so much thought into every detail. There was a tree bursting with ornaments, most of them handmade over the years, and stockings hung by the fireplace with our names stitched in. The gifts were overwhelming. My sister and I unwrapped clothes, books, and even some gadgets we'd never thought we'd own. My grandparents always had a way of making us feel special, but it wasn't just about the presents. It was about the effort they put into making sure we felt loved and supported, especially during a time of year when we missed my dad the most. Still, as much as I tried to focus on the joy of the moment, there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the situation back home. My mom's words echoed in my mind, and I found myself wondering how my step and half-siblings were spending their day. I knew it wouldn't be the same for them, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. Even so, I couldn't regret my decision. Being with my grandparents reminded me of who I was and where I came from. For a few hours, I felt like I belonged. But I also knew the price of that choice would hit as soon as I stepped back through the door at home. The fallout came quicker than I expected. My sister posted pictures from our Christmas celebration on social media, a tradition she'd started a few years back. The photos showed us smiling by the tree, opening gifts, and posing with our grandparents. At the time, it felt like a harmless way to capture the day. We didn't think much about who might see them, but my mom did. She found the pictures the next morning, and her reaction was immediate. When we got home, she was waiting for us, phone in hand, with an expression that was equal parts anger and disappointment. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Do you know how hurtful this is to your siblings?" I didn't know what to say. She held up her phone and started scrolling through the pictures. "Look at this," she said. "It's like you're flaunting it. All those gifts, all that money they spent, while the rest of us sat here with nothing." Her words hit hard, and for a moment I felt like the worst person in the world. I tried to explain that the photos weren't meant to hurt anyone. "It's not about them," I said. "It's about us spending time with our family." But it was clear my mum didn't see it that way. To her, the pictures were proof of everything she'd been saying, that my sister and I were better off than the rest of the family, and that we didn't care about how it made them feel. I ended up leaving most of my gifts at my grandparents' house. It wasn't worth the fight to bring them home, but even with the physical reminders out of sight, the tension lingered. No matter how much I tried to justify my choices, it felt like nothing I said could make things better. The gifts became the centerpiece of the argument in the days that followed. My mum couldn't let it go, and honestly, I wasn't sure if she was more upset about the gifts themselves or what they symbolized. Every time she brought it up, her frustration spilled out in sharp words that hit harder than she probably realized. "You don't see how this creates a divide, do you?" she said one evening, pacing the living room while I sat on the couch, trying to avoid her gaze. "Your grandparents are making it impossible for us to be a family. How are your siblings supposed to feel when they see all this? Like they don't matter? I tried to explain my side, but it felt like my words were bouncing off a wall. It's not like I asked for all this stuff, I said. They just want to help. They care about me and my sister. That's it. It's not about hurting anyone else. But my mom wasn't convinced. It doesn't matter what they mean to do, she snapped. The result is the same. You and your sister come back with everything, and the others get left behind. Do you really think that's fair? Fair. That word hung in the air like a challenge. I wanted to argue that fairness wasn't the point, that my grandparents didn't owe anything to my step-and-half siblings, but deep down, I could see why she was upset. To her, the gifts were a glaring reminder of a divide she'd been trying to bridge for years. In the end, I kept most of my thoughts to myself. It didn't seem worth fighting over, especially when I knew how deeply my mum's feelings ran. But even as I nodded along to her arguments, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't wrong for accepting what my grandparents offered. They were honoring my dad's memory in the only way they knew how, and I couldn't bring myself to reject that, no matter how complicated it made things at home. After days of arguing, my mom finally sat me down for one last conversation. This time, she wasn't angry. She was tired. "Do you really not see what this is doing to us?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "It's like you're choosing them over your family here." Her words stung, but I stood my ground. "It's not about choosing sides," I said. "They're part of my family too. They're the only connection I have left to Dad. I can't just cut them out because it makes things harder here." She shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "I'm not asking you to cut them out. I'm asking you to think about how this looks to the rest of the family. Your siblings see you come back with all these gifts, and it's like rubbing salt in the wound." I paused before responding, trying to choose my words carefully. "I get that it's hard for them," I said, "but this isn't about them. It's about Dad's family wanting to be there for me and my sister. That doesn't mean I don't care about the rest of the family, but it's different." My mom sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I just wish you could see it from my perspective," she said. "I'm trying to hold this family together, and this makes it feel impossible." In that moment, I felt a wave of guilt. I could see how much this was hurting her, but I also couldn't deny what was important to me. My connection to my grandparents wasn't something I was willing to let go of, no matter how messy it made things. "I'm sorry," I said finally, "but I can't give this up." My mom didn't reply. She just nodded and walked away, leaving the conversation unfinished. My sister and I had always been on the same page when it came to our dad's family, but seeing how firm she was about it made me realize how different we were in handling the conflict. While I struggled with the guilt and tension at home, she had no problem standing her ground, no matter what anyone said. "They're not our responsibility," she told me one night as we sat in our room, talking about the latest argument with Mom. "I get that she wants everything to be fair, but life isn't fair. Our grandparents don't owe anyone anything except us." Her bluntness made sense. She had always been fiercely loyal to Dad's memory and our connection to his family. For her, the choice was simple. Our grandparents had every right to focus on us, and there was nothing wrong with accepting their generosity. But even as she spoke, I could feel a gap between how she saw things and how I felt. "I know they don't owe anyone anything," I said, "but it's not about what they owe, it's about how it makes everyone feel. Mom's trying to hold this family together, and every time we come back from there, it's like we're tearing it apart." My sister shrugged. "That's not on us," she said. "Mom's trying to force something that doesn't exist. Her family isn't their family. It sucks, but that's reality." She had a way of cutting through the noise, of seeing things in black and white. I envied her confidence, but I couldn't share it. For me, it wasn't just about being right. It was about the weight of the situation and how it affected everyone involved. My sister could separate herself from that, but I wasn't built the same way. Still, her perspective helped me feel less alone. She reminded me that it was okay to hold on to the people who mattered to us, even if it came with complications. "We've already lost so much," she said. "I'm not giving them up too, and you shouldn't either." Her certainty gave me strength, even when everything else felt uncertain. As the weeks went on, I found myself thinking more and more about the word fairness. It seemed to be at the heart of everything, my mom's frustration, my siblings' resentment, and even my own guilt. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that fairness wasn't as simple as everyone wanted it to be. Was it fair that my sister and I had grandparents who cared for us and supported us in ways our step and half siblings didn't have? No, not really. But was it fair to ask my grandparents to extend that same support to kids they didn't know, kids who weren't their family? That didn't feel right either. Life didn't seem to care much about being fair. It was messy and uneven, and there wasn't a perfect solution. At school, I overheard classmates talking about their holiday breaks, laughing about family traditions and big dinners. Listening to them made me wonder if anyone else's family was as complicated as mine. I wanted to believe that what my mom was asking for wasn't unreasonable. But every time I pictured Christmas without my grandparents, it felt like losing a part of myself. I tried to imagine how my step and half siblings must have felt, watching me and my sister come back with more than they had. I hated the idea of them feeling left out, but I also hated the idea of giving up the one connection I had left to my dad. It felt like an impossible choice, one that no one should have to make. In the end, I kept circling back to the same question. Was it wrong to prioritize the people who had been there for me, even if it meant others felt hurt? I didn't have the answer, but I knew it was something I'd be wrestling with for a long time. The tension in our house didn't disappear after Christmas. It lingered, like a shadow over everything. My mom stopped bringing up the gifts or the pictures, but the unspoken resentment was still there. I could feel it every time my step-siblings gave me a side glance, or when my mom sighed heavily as she walked past my room. The divide that had been simmering for years now felt permanent, like something none of us could fix. I started to wonder what the long-term impact of all this would be. Would we ever be able to feel like one united family? Or had too much happened to make that possible? My sister seemed resigned to the idea that we'd always be separate, at least in some way. "It's just the way things are," she told me when I brought it up. "We're not going to magically become the Brady Bunch." Still, I couldn't let go of the hope that things might change someday. I wanted to believe that my step and half siblings could understand why my grandparents were important to me, and that my mom could come to terms with the situation without feeling like it was a betrayal. But with each passing day, that hope felt more and more distant. My grandparents, on the other hand, stayed the same. They continued to call every week and invited us over whenever it was allowed. They didn't seem bothered by the drama at home, or if they were, they never let it show. For them, their role was simple. They were there for my sister and me, no matter what. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when I got older. Would I still feel this torn between the two sides of my family? Would I be able to maintain both relationships without sacrificing one for the other? The uncertainty weighed on me. But for now, all I could do was take it one day at a time. Whatever the future held, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I also knew I wasn't ready to give up on either side of my family just yet. So here I am, laying everything out for you, and wondering if I'm the one in the wrong. The choices I've made feel right to me, but they've caused so much tension at home that I can't help but second-guess myself. Did I handle things the best way I could, or did I let my family down? My grandparents have always been there for me and my sister. They've been a constant source of support, a connection to my dad, and a reminder of where we came from. I know they're not perfect, and I understand why their refusal to include my step and half siblings hurts my mum so much. But they've never claimed to be anything other than what they are, grandparents to me and my sister. I don't think it's wrong for them to focus on us, especially when they're one of the few links we have left to our dad. At the same time, I can see why my mum feels the way she does. She's trying to create a family where everyone feels equal, where no one is left out. I don't think she's wrong for wanting that. But is it fair to ask me to sacrifice my relationship with my grandparents to achieve it? To me, that feels like losing another piece of my dad, and I've already lost so much of him. Then there are my siblings. They didn't choose to be part of this complicated dynamic, and I hate that they feel excluded. I know how much it must hurt to see my sister and me come back from my grandparents' house with gifts and stories they can't share in. But is it really my responsibility to fix that? Or is it okay for me to hold on to the family that's been there for me, even if it creates friction at home? I don't know if there's a right answer to any of this. All I know is that I'm trying to navigate a situation that feels impossible. I'm doing my best to balance the love I have for my dad's family with the loyalty I feel toward the family I live with every day. So, what do you think? Am I the bad guy for going to my grandparents' house and accepting their gifts, knowing how much it upsets my mom and siblings? Or is it okay to prioritize the people who've always been there for me, even when it's messy?